I walk a straight line, shackled and chained. Oh, gruesome Gertie is calling my name. There is no mercy in this penitentiary. Just ask the Hillstring Gang or Angola 3. I'm here for life, I'm here to die. Inside these walls, inside the wire. And when the wolf cries, I know it's over. Oh, bloody Angola. Oh, bloody Angola.
It's been a very difficult day. As you can see, I lost 2 good officers today. I have a number of sheriffs here and law enforcement throughout the state who are helping us deal with this matter. But first, let me say this. Please pray for the 2 officers that were ambushed early this morning. I have 2 deceased officers. One, Brandon Nielsen, he's 34 years old. And another one, Officer Jeremy Triche, he's 28 years old. This entire tragedy unfolded early this morning as one of my officers was working the traffic detail in this particular parking lot. As he was working this detail, for some unknown reason at this time, a gunman opened fire on him multiple times. As you can see, the car that's parked over here on the shoulder of Bayou Steel Road, that officer is presently at University Hospital being treated for multiple gunshot wounds. He should be okay. After the shooting took place, we were able to get a call from a citizen. Based on the description we got from the officer, a citizen advised St. John Sheriff's Office of a speeding motorist on a street by Riverview Trailer Court. Officers proceeded to that area where we found a vehicle matching the description of the vehicle used in the shooting here on Bayou Steel Road. Officers came in contact with some individuals. During this investigation, one of the subjects, as officers were handcuffing one of the subjects, that investigation led us to a trailer. When we knocked on the door, another person came to the door with a dog, where we could see inside where another individual was fully clothed but laying under a blanket. The officers asked him to step outside. As we were interviewing the 2 persons, the 2 subjects, another person exited that trailer with an assault weapon and ambushed by 2 officers. The investigation is ongoing. I took my officers away from the investigation. The Louisiana State Police are now taking over the investigation.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to Bloody Angola, a podcast 142 years in the making, the complete story of America's bloodiest prison. I'm Jim Chapman, and before we get into today's episode, I want to mention why it was previously pulled and re-recorded. So upon the initial release of this episode a few weeks ago, I was contacted, and there were some discrepancies between some of the sourcing articles I used and those that, well, all I'm going to say is there was some people close to the case, and they had what I will refer to as direct knowledge. Some of it related to the type of weapon used in the initial shooting, and there were several things that occurred when the second shooting took place that I did not detail because the information I had at the time did not stipulate it. So if you cover cases long enough, such as I have for the past 6 plus years, sometimes this happens. The information that you source, even if it's from credible sources, can be incorrect or be incomplete. And it's very important to me that what I tell you is as accurate as possible. Now, everyone that knows me knows there is no one more pro law enforcement than myself. I work with law enforcement, and most of, well, I would say 80% of my circle, if you will, are law enforcement folks. So when it came to this case, even though I was not asked to pull that episode, I found it best to pull it, get some additional facts, and re-record it. So that is what I did, and let's get into it. And I'm going to cover a tragic story that occurred on August 16th of 2012 in LaPlace, Louisiana. Now, sadly, that resulted in the death of 2 St. John Parish sheriff's deputies and 2 more being wounded. So I'm going to cover the details of what happened and the results, which do include a death sentence inside of Bloody Angola for one of the perpetrators. So let's get started. And first, as I said, this took place in LaPlace, Louisiana, which LaPlace is a town. It's located in St. John Parish. It's part of the New Orleans metro area, if you will. And the town runs along the east bank of the Mississippi River. And it's a kind of a quaint bedroom community with roughly 28,000 residents. Now, LaPlace is known as the andouille capital of the world, and this was an honor bestowed on the town by popular Governor Edwin Edwards in the 1970s. And because of this honor and being known as the andouille capital of the world, the town does host an andouille festival every year in October, and it's done so since 1972. It's just a charming area. It's blended with some Cajun heritage, river life, and Southern hospitality. So definitely not the type of place you would expect the incident I'm about to tell you about occurring. And this whole incident kicked off at the Valero Refinery parking lot initially. And y'all, Valero is a global gas refinery in the area that offers high-paying jobs to plant workers that work typically 12-hour shifts. Now, that particular morning, Michael Scott Boynton was doing extra duty. He was in the parking lot of the refinery. He was a sheriff's deputy. And what I'm about to tell you is according to the testimony of someone that was in the vehicle we're going to talk about. Her name was Tanisha Bright. So according to her testimony, she said that morning, her and the coworker she was riding with, they all got off work at 4 a.m. from the Valero refinery, and they piled into a guy by the name of Terry Smith's truck. And she said they were in their usual seating arrangement, which was Bright in the front seat, Terry Smith driving, and his son, Brian Smith, on the other side of the front seat. So she was in the middle. In the rear seat of that truck, there was a guy by the name of Joekel and a guy by the name of Derek Smith. So you have 5 people total in that vehicle. Terry Smith, Miss Bright, and Terry Smith's son, Brian, in the front seat. And then in the back seat of that truck, you had Derek Smith and Joekel. Now, she said initially everything seemed fine. Nobody seemed pissed off or anything. And as they neared the road, a deputy working the gate shined his flashlight into the truck and walked towards the truck's open window. She said the deputy, who was 33-year-old Michael Boynton, who she said she did not know at the time, she described as very agitated. She said she could tell by his body language and the tone of his voice. She said she didn't know why they had been stopped by Michael Boynton or flagged down, if you will, but that Terry Smith refused to pull over. She said the officer and Smith then exchanged some words and it got kind of heated, and that Boynton asked Terry Smith for what's known as his TWIC card, which y'all, a TWIC card is basically a government issued ID card, kind of like an ID for people working in the maritime industry. Think of it similar to a driver's license. Terry Smith refused to turn over his TWIC card, and in the meantime, from the back seat, Kyle Joekel started shouting for Terry Smith to drive away. She said at that point, Terry Smith basically gunned it and peeled out of the parking lot, and she saw Deputy Boynton run back to his vehicle to provide chase. Now, this is her testimony in court. She said the deputy soon caught up with them and he was right on their trail, and then he pulled to the right side of the car and he was on the shoulder at this point, kind of driving along with them. And she said at that point, Terry Smith veered into the line of oncoming traffic, but he had to jerk back into his lane because a car was heading in his direction. She said at that point, she felt something brush her leg. She looked down, and Brian Smith, who is, remember, the son of the driver, Terry Smith, he had grabbed an assault rifle. She said at that point, he asked his father, Terry Smith, if he could shoot, and his father didn't say anything. She said at that point, Brian starts firing through the window at the deputy, and Boynton was hit. Now, according to her testimony, she said she then pleaded with Terry Smith to pull over and let her out, and that basically she described it as him being in zombie mode. He just kept his eyes straight ahead on the road and didn't say anything. Now, before we go any further, I want to say a few things about Tanisha Bright and how she got caught up in all of this, because she was really innocent in her role. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong guys. Now, according to her testimony, she had moved to Louisiana from California with her mother. That was just a few months before the shooting occurred. She said she lived in a hotel that was nearby where she worked at that Valero refinery, and that she worked for a contracting company that worked on a project there. So these folks did not work directly for Valero Refinery. They were contractor workers. They were working for somebody else who had a job in that plant. Now, somehow her mother knew Terry Smith. He was an acquaintance of some sort, and her mother also knew that he worked overtime for that same contractor. And she had arranged for Tanisha Bright to catch a ride to and from work with Terry Smith and the other folks that I just mentioned. But her mother also warned her daughter that Smith had, quote, a big gun that he always carried, and she was talking about Brian Smith, and she even told her daughter that he called his gun his girlfriend. And she would describe Brian Smith in particular, who did this shooting, as very paranoid, and that he always felt like people were watching him and trying to kidnap him, and that one of the reasons he carried this assault rifle was because of his paranoia. So back to it, Tanisha Bright said that after the shooting of Deputy Boynton, they drove to Riverview Mobile Home Park. This is in LaPlace, which is where the Smiths and family friend Kyle Joekel, who was also in that truck, if you'll remember, they lived in a series of 4 trailers. She said as soon as they got there, they all got out of the truck. And at that point, she tried to run, but she slipped in the gravel. She testified at that point, Brian Smith turned toward her, still holding that assault rifle, and she said, quote, I assumed if he thought I was going to run, that will be the end of me. So she was like, screw that, I'm staying. She said at that point, the group huddled on the concrete patio outside of the trailer that Terry Smith shared with his wife. And at that point, Terry Smith ordered everyone into that trailer. She said once they got back in the trailer, they started hearing sirens in the background. And she said everyone started to panic. She said at that point, she went toward the bathroom to hide because she was afraid of what was about to happen next. She said she heard an officer knock on the trailer door and that Terry Smith and Kyle Joekel went out of the door to talk to that officer. Now, her perspective from the inside of that trailer is that after Terry Smith and Kyle Joekel went outside, Terry Smith's wife, a woman by the name of Chanel Skanes, told her that they should blame Joekel for everything. That was her testimony. Now, going on to say that Terry Smith's wife called Kyle Joekel crazy. She said at that point, she backed up further into the bathroom and that Brian Smith and his girlfriend joined her in that bathroom, and his girlfriend's name was Brittany Keith. She said that while she was in the bathroom, Brian Smith got nervous because he thought his dad was going to tell on him for shooting Deputy Boynton. She said at that point, she heard shouting from outside the trailer, and quoting the shouting, she said that she heard, quote, "I know you fucking did it. I know it was you." And she said she believed it came from a deputy. At that point, she said someone else screamed. It sounded muffled, like someone was shouting while lying face down in the dirt. She went on to say that she heard the words "help" and then "help Brian," and said she did not recognize the voice of who was saying that. She said she also heard someone shout, "Brian, kill them all." She said at that point, Brian Smith ran from the bathroom. She also said at that point that she started wedging herself behind a washing machine, that she rolled into a ball. She put her hands over her ears, and all she heard was the sound of an assault rifle. And she said, "I knew it was an assault rifle because I recognized the sound of the shots as being the same sound of the shots from that first shooting at the Valero Refinery." She said she could also hear different sounding shots, is how she would describe it. And she said she knew those were shots fired from a pistol and not an assault rifle. Now, she estimated the shooting lasted around 30 seconds. She said Brian Smith at that point stumbled back into the trailer and he was bleeding badly from a wound to his leg, and that he fell inside of the trailer. His girlfriend, Brittany Keith, then started screaming "help." And then she said at that point, Kyle Joekel then returned to the inside of the trailer. He also was bleeding. And Chanel Skanes also returned to the trailer. And according to Bright's testimony, she was shot through the arm. She said that she called 911. And at that point, Brian Smith, she overheard him tell his girlfriend to tell police he surrendered. And at that point, Tanisha Bright runs out of the trailer and runs to a police car, and a deputy helped her into a neighbor's trailer, she testified. So that's her story. And I'm going to give you some other perspectives. And I mentioned Chanel Skanes, who was the wife of Terry Smith, and she also testified in the trial. Now, she testified that when the first shots rang out, she was crouched under a picnic table outside of that trailer. She said her stepson at the time, who was Brian Smith, was the man who began firing at deputies at that trailer park. She testified she screamed for Brian Smith to please stop. "You're going to kill everybody. Please stop." And she said deputies returned fire and hit Smith, and he dropped his AK-47 and fled back into the trailer. She said it wasn't long after the shooting would start again, just as she was starting to crawl away from that picnic table. She said she noticed Kyle Joekel, who at this point had been detained by deputies. Somehow he escapes during all this chaos when Brian Smith started shooting from the trailer. She said she saw him pick up the assault rifle and start firing again. She said at that point, she started screaming again, quote, "Stop, oh my God, you're killing somebody." She said it was during that second round of shooting that she saw Kyle Joekel stand over an already injured deputy by the name of Brandon Nielsen and shoot the AK-47 from point blank range, killing him. She then told the jury that after the shooting had stopped, she ran over to another deputy, later identified as Jeremy Triche, and she was holding his hand, telling him it was going to be okay, help is on the way, just trying to comfort this hero who was shot and dying by this point. And she said it was at that point that Terry Smith, her husband, went up to Deputy Jeremy Triche and flipped him over so that he was lying on his stomach. She said at that point, Terry Smith told her to get away. She said she continued to hold this deputy's hand and assure him help will be on the way, and that he took one big breath and stopped breathing. That was her testimony in court. So there was another officer who was injured during the shootout at that trailer park, and his name was Deputy Jason Triche, and he testified for about 90 minutes, and he was very seriously wounded. As a matter of fact, his wounds were so bad that when he awoke from a medically induced coma more than a month after the shootings, he was missing his gallbladder, his spleen, and one of his kidneys. He was quite frankly lucky to be alive. Just horrible, tragic, and horrific. And he admitted during his testimony that all of this had caused some memory loss with him, but he really did his best to recount the details of August 16th of 2012 and the events that led up to the shooting from his own perspective. And he said on August 15th, he had been assigned to a graveyard shift, which was 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., and he testified that around 5 a.m., he heard a transmission over his radio that a man had been shot and was lying in the street. And he said it was much later that he would find out that that man, that deputy, was Michael Scott Boynton. And of course, the shooting being referenced here is the initial shooting at that Valero plant. He said he drove to the reported shooting scene in LaPlace, and he said the radio traffic was not completely clear, so he wasn't 100% sure of what to expect. He said when he arrived, there were several sheriff's units that were already on the scene, and that at that point, another message came over his radio, this time reporting a suspicious vehicle that was headed towards the Riverview Mobile Home Park in LaPlace. So at that point, he starts heading that way. He said that he arrived at the trailer park and he saw two deputies who responded to the dispatch report. Now, one of those deputies was named Anthony Bullock, and the other one was named Brandon Nielsen. He went on to say it was pitch dark and they were trying to locate this suspicious vehicle using a flashlight, and that they in fact did locate the vehicle. It was in some weeds in the rear of the trailer park. And he said at that point, the three deputies, they band together to investigate the vehicle. And at that point, a fourth deputy arrives on the scene, and that was Jeremy Triche. And this was roughly 15 minutes after he had arrived on scene. The deputies were then told that the suspicious vehicle was a pickup truck and that he and Deputy Nielsen went to check that out, and they were joined by Deputy Jeremy Triche. Meanwhile, he said that Bullock was about 50 yards away from him, and he started talking to a man who the deputy testified he couldn't make out his features at the time, but he could tell it was a man, and he could tell that this man was standing near a picnic table in the trailer park. Now, in prior testimony, Bullock had already identified that man who he was talking to, and he identified him as Terry Smith. And as a matter of fact, I want to pick up with Bullock's testimony quickly, because he mentioned that he spoke to Terry Smith for 10 minutes or so, and that he wasn't convinced that Terry Smith did not have anything to do with the shooting at the Valero plant, even though Terry Smith was doing his best to convince this deputy of that. He said after about 10 minutes, he noticed Terry Smith's demeanor starting to change, and that Terry Smith got very nervous, according to Deputy Bullock. He said it was at that point Terry Smith literally started having the shakes. He said he noticed some black residue on Terry Smith's hands, and he said to this day he doesn't know what that black residue was, but it looked like something that he had gripped. He said that once he noticed the residue, he called out to Jeremy Triche, who would join his fellow deputy. And according to Bullock, it was at that point he grabbed Smith's hand And that's when Smith got really defensive in his words. Deputy Bullock said Smith tried to run, but that he wrestled Smith to the ground and he put handcuffs on him. And at that point, he asked him if anyone else was in the trailer, to which Terry Smith replied that his wife was in the trailer. He said that's when he approached the trailer and he saw a large dog at the door, and he called to Terry Smith's wife to put the dog on a leash. Bullock said he then asked to speak to Chanel Skanes, who was Terry Smith's wife, inside of the trailer, and he said the reason he wanted to do that was to prevent communication between Terry Smith and Chanel Skanes, so they couldn't get their stories together, right? So he said upon entering that trailer, he noticed a man under a blanket in the bedroom, and he said he could see this man's hands moving under that blanket, under the cover, and he didn't know what was under that cover with this guy, of course. So he draws his weapon and he ordered this man to show his hands. Now, that man was later identified as Kyle Joekel. And he said that Kyle Joekel complied, and that himself, along with Chanel Skanes and Kyle Joekel, then all exit that trailer together. He said when they exited the trailer and once they got outside of it, Kyle Joekel takes off running, and Bullock said that he took off after him. He catches up to him and he starts handcuffing Kyle Joekel. And he said that's when Brian Smith appeared from the trailer. He was brandishing an AK-47, and of course, all hell breaks loose. Now, picking up with a little bit more of Jason Triche's testimony, he said that it was a split second when he saw Deputy Brandon Nielsen and Jeremy Triche get shot. He said at that point, he took off running and he got shot in the back. He grabbed his weapon and he shot several times back at the individuals. Jason Triche said he did make it back to his vehicle and he was actually able to make it to the hospital. And as I told you, several weeks later, after about a month in a coma, he finally woke up. Now, as far as Deputy Bullock, he said he took shelter behind the trailer after Brian Smith started shooting. And he said in one hand, he had the gun that he had pulled out of Kyle Joekel's waistband. And in the other hand, he was firing with his own weapon. He also testified that he saw Deputy Nielsen fall and that he saw Deputies Jeremy Triche and Jason Triche running in the same direction toward some nearby railroad tracks. He said at this point he was positioned behind the trailer and he and the gunman were actually firing at each other through the mobile home. He said that's when Kyle Joekel, who had been on the ground, ran back toward the front of the trailer and out of his view. He said after Deputy Nielsen was struck by bullets, he saw a pair of legs from the other side of the trailer. And it was at that point that he made it to a nearby white pickup truck and took cover behind the truck. And he was able to shoot the person whose legs were visible, presumably the legs. He said he didn't watch as the person began crawling toward the door of the trailer. Now, Deputy Bullock also testified that he saw a gunman standing over Deputy Nielsen, who had been shot, and that he saw this person, who was later identified as Kyle Joekel, fire several shots into the fallen deputy's body, execution style. He also testified that as the bullets were flying, another deputy by the name of Charles Whale approached the scene, and that he basically flagged the deputy down and told him, "Stop, don't come any closer." And so that's the details that I have in this just absolutely horrific, infuriating shooting in which two deputies were killed. St. John Sheriff's Deputy Brandon Nielsen and Deputy Jeremy Triche, and two deputies were wounded. Of course, Michael Boynton at the first scene and Jason Triche wounded at the trailer park scene, if you will. And police would discover that these guys were members of what was called a sovereign citizen movement. And let me explain to you quickly what a sovereign citizen allegedly is. And it's, I guess the best way to tell you is it's an extremist movement of a bunch of people who don't believe in any sort of law. They believe you're in charge of yourself, essentially, and they don't recognize law enforcement at all. They don't believe in taxes. They don't believe in authority, and they refer back to laws that existed when the country was very first founded as something to stand on as far as their beliefs are concerned. It's absolutely ridiculous, in my opinion, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But let's just say that they don't believe in any authority whatsoever, and they typically hate cops because they're law enforcement and they don't believe in law enforcement, and they don't believe in anybody expressing any authority over them. So I'm going to break down for you now, because there's so many players in this one, who each of these individuals were and what happened to them. And I'm going to tell you that there's one in particular that it's really going to shock you when I get to him. But we're going to start with Terry Smith, who was involved in that initial shooting at the Valero Refinery. Remember, he was the driver. He was approximately 44 years old at the time of this shooting. And there's not a whole lot of details about his early life, but he was very involved in the sovereign citizen movement. He would proclaim himself as a common law judge, and he would lead a small group of sovereign citizens in the area. So he was kind of like the patriarch of this group, if you will. And of course, he gets arrested for his role in the initial shooting. But guess what? His role in the shooting, that attempted murder of the initial officer at the Valero plant, Deputy Boynton, it never goes to trial. Why? Because he had another case pending that would send him to bloody Angola to serve multiple life sentences for rape. And let me tell you how disgusting this guy is. And I'm going to reference an article, and this article was written by Dan Swenson. It ran in the Times-Picayune on October 5th of 2012, and it kind of discusses Terry Smith's past. And it reads, Adam, Tennessee. A police car crunched up in the trailer park's gravel drive, headed for the family exiled to the far back corner. They were so ornery, so prone to troublemaking, that their landlord had moved them there to lot 28A just to get him out of the way. It was November of last year when the detective came for 44-year-old Terry Lynn Smith, accused of raping a teenage relative. What she found instead would take her months later to St. John the Baptist Parish. A stack of papers she carried from that trailer would help piece together a puzzle of the Smiths, their connection to a Nebraska fugitive, and the senseless doctrine that might have driven them to gun down 4 sheriff's deputies in cold blood. On November 9th, Robertson County, Tennessee Detective Angela Looney arrived at the Smiths camp. 2 trailers side by side at the Red River Valley camp in Adams, Tennessee. The Smiths weren't home. But a skinny redhead bolted from that camper. He ran for the wood line, leaped off a steep wooded bluff, and disappeared into the woods. An old white Buick with Nebraska tags sat parked outside. It had been stolen 2 months earlier, Looney learned, by a skinny, redheaded fugitive named Kyle Joekel, wanted in 2 states for dealing dope and threatening to kill police officers. Inside the Smiths camper, Looney found an arsenal of guns and ammunition and a stack of papers she hoped would lead her to Terry Smith's missing teenage relative. Quote, I started looking through it and I discovered more than what I went there for. The documents linked the Smith family to the militant anti-government group called Sovereign Citizens, whose thousands of members recognize no authority higher than their own. They dabble in conspiracy theories and file cryptic lawsuits protesting the unfairness of taxes and driver's license, and sometimes they spiral into violence. The Smiths, they were arrogant. They didn't care about anybody but themselves. That from their landlord in Tennessee. I hate to say it, but I could see that ending coming. The mere mention of Terry Smith drives a grizzled old man in North Louisiana to weep, to beat his head against the doorframe of his rickety old house, to curse God and Smith and anyone else who will listen. Quote, "He's killing me," he sobs. Richard Skanes has long white hair, wears cowboy boots and denim shirts, and sinks to his knees at the thought of Smith. His daughter, Chanel, met the man years ago. Her father begged her not to marry him. Smith was manipulative. Skanes could see. He brought up his two boys mean, just like him. But his daughter married Terry Smith anyway, and the two took off to travel from state to state, factory job to factory job. Skanes heard of the child molestation cases in Tennessee, and he said he helped Looney to try to find Smith. He begged the police to arrest him. Quote, "I hate that son of a bitch, and I always did," he said of his son-in-law. "I told the detective, if I see him, I'm going to kill him. You better catch him before I do." But he didn't see Smith ever again, and neither did that detective. On the morning of the massacre in the LaPlace trailer park, Chanel Skanes ran screaming from her trailer in an effort to protect the deputies. That according to witnesses. Quote, "Don't shoot them," she wailed, a neighbor said. She threw herself on top of a fallen deputy as the neighbor watched, begging her husband's son and Kyle Joekel to stop firing. They allegedly shot her in the arm. She is charged as an accomplice in the shooting of the first deputy in the parking lot. A week later, Skanes' father stood on his lawn littered with broken bicycles, trash, and old tires, and laminated that his daughter, who he said was a good girl, married such a dangerous man. So dangerous, so mean, he said, that somebody should have seen it coming and locked him up a long time ago. Those cops didn't have to die. His former landlord in that trailer park remembered just 3 tenants of the hundreds he had last year. Quote, "You don't remember the good people. You just don't. You remember the troublemakers." And his threshold for recollection is high. One of the 3 bad ones, he recalled, stole his canoes, cut them into pieces, and sold them a few towns over. Another was caught with a dead prostitute in his trailer. The third, the Smiths, was a family so unruly that the landlord insisted they move to the furthest back corner of the campground's overflow lot. The campsite's 78 lots were full in November due to a semiconductor plant that was under construction in nearby Clarksville, Tennessee. Until then, the landlord and his father had run a sleepy canoe camp, a place for weekend getaways and field trips on the Red River, which snaked along the back edge of the camp's shady main lot. They are more accustomed to nailing flip-flops to their trademark, quote, "Tree of Souls," and telling ghost stories to children than they are housing bad laborers. But the Chamber of Commerce had asked that they expand, even temporarily, to allow workers a place to live. The landlord charged the workers $400 a month in rent, and for the most part, left them alone. The landlord got the impression Joekel was a follower, impressionable, and easy to reel in. The Smiths, he believes, became Joekel's outlaw family, bonded in blood and guns and a shared distaste for authority. When the law came for the patriarch, the Smiths had to run, and Joekel had nowhere else to go, so he figured he might as well run with them, the landlord said. They all snuck back in the next day, long enough to hook up their trailers to their trucks and haul them away. Then the Smiths and Joekel once again slipped away. The landlord didn't know where they were headed. At the time, he didn't care, so long as they were gone. But Looney kept looking. She issued a bulletin through the Tennessee Fusion Center declaring Terry Smith wanted for questioning in a child sex abuse case. He had a history that wove through a half a dozen states, the bulletin warned, and was affiliated with a militant organization prone to domestic terrorism. He should be considered dangerous. A half a year later, a hitchhiker thumbing a ride on a desolate stretch of the highway in North Louisiana would offer a similar warning about the Smiths. The family, he told yet another sheriff, this one 600 miles from Tennessee, had moved into the back of a trailer park in their town. They had a lot of guns, he said, and they didn't like the law. And that's how that reg gives you kind of a view of how just horrible these people were. And of course, that article started off talking about a rape of a family member that the patriarch of this group, Terry Smith, was accused of molesting, and that victim was identified as his minor stepdaughter. Now, according to documents, he raped her for over 10 years, with the abuse starting in 2004 when this little girl was just 7 years old and continuing until the summer of 2011 when she was 17. And the acts included vaginal penetration, oral sex, and even object insertion into her. And he would threaten this poor little girl that he would kill the entire family if she ever told. Now, in 2011, when this little girl escapes the Smith's home, she reported it. And there was apparently plenty of evidence to substantiate this, and he eventually pleaded guilty to the charges. And just as sick and disgusting as this is, when they interviewed her mother admitted to ignoring the signs of this. And it would be hard for me to believe she didn't know what was going on after all of that time. So he has a ton of rape charges here, and he eventually gets sentenced for this. This was in March of 2016, and he gets 2 life terms consecutive with no probation, plus 50 years of hard labor on some other charges. He ends up getting life plus. Terry Smith ain't never getting out of prison, thank God. And all of that was tied to those original child rape charges of a family member. And none of that sentence was tied to what occurred in St. John Parish. Now, of course, he appealed all that shit, and those appeals were denied. And let me tell you something. I don't know anything about this guy as far as how he's going about his life inside of Bloody Angola, but I can tell you convicts don't like chomos. That's all I'm going to say. They don't like chomos. So he's either in protective custody, so to speak, meaning they don't let him in general population, or he's having quite a hard time, and I feel not the least bit sorry for him. So that's who Terry Smith was. And before I go any further, I want to make this very clear. Nobody gives a shit about these people that were involved in this from the standpoint of the perpetrators, but you have to tell the story, the who, what, why, where, and how. And I just want to make that clear. I am telling the complete full story, and you can't tell the complete full story without going over what happened to these people and how much trouble they were causing even before all this went down. So I want to make that clear. I don't give a fuck about these people, but I have to tell the story. So I'll move on. I told you about Terry Smith. We're going to talk about his son, Brian Smith, who was one of the 2 shooters at the trailer park. He was 24 years old when all this went down. Of course, he was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. And to give you a little background on him, obviously he was very much influenced by his piece of shit rapist father. He was homeschooled, and at the time growing up, not much is known about him outside of the fact that he was considered a major troublemaker, kind of looked like a punk, and he heavily embraced the sovereign citizen ideology. But here's something that may surprise you in his case. He was also never convicted or sentenced in this case of these shootings, even though he had 2 charges of first-degree murder, which are death penalty charges, right? Why? Well, he was considered mentally incompetent to stand trial. He was actually diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia with psychosis, and even though he was never sentenced in this case, he will never see the free world again because he is hospitalized in Jackson, Louisiana, where there is a state hospital where you put people that are just mentally incompetent, and he will be at that hospital for the rest of his life. So just to give you an idea of the timeline of his case, on August 24th of 2012, he gets charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder plus 3 counts of attempted first-degree murder. On August 25th of 2012, he gets indicted for those charges. In August of 2013, the following year, a motion is filed with his attorneys to bar the death penalty, and they cited mental illness. And they have a hearing, and in that hearing, some psychiatrist speaks, and he confirms that this guy suffers from schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia. And look, from there, this case drug out all the way to 2020 before a judge by the name of Sterling Snowdy ruled him mentally incompetent to stand trial. And that was spurred by an audio recording from 2017 from a hearing where this guy just goes on a rant in the hearing about the government targeting him. And as you would expect, he's acting just completely crazy. But it was a good example of his stability, which is non-existent in this guy's case. And that was enough, I guess, to convince the judge that he was mentally incompetent to stand trial. Not saying I agree with it. I would have made him stand trial personally, but that is the facts of what the judge found. Now, one thing that came out as police investigated was he had a unique bond with the next guy that we're going to talk about, which is Kyle Joekel. And he was the other shooter at that trailer park, the one that picked up the AK-47. So let's get into Kyle Joekel.
Jim, did you see what happened in Texas today?
Wait, before you tell me that, let me tell you what happened in New York.
It cannot be as crazy as the case I told you about yesterday in Louisiana.
You know what? We should do a podcast about it.
And with that, we did. Crime Wire Weekly covers the crime news headlines that have dominated the week.
We cover trending crimes from all over the country and even sprinkle in a few globally.
Crime Wire Weekly is available now wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Simply by searching Crime Wire Weekly or clicking the link in the description of this podcast. He was indicted for 2 counts of first-degree murder. And a little about his early life. He was born in 1985. He was 28 when all this went down. As of today, he is around 40 years old. He's a white male, and he grew up actually in Nebraska on a farm. And his early life was troubled. It was rough. Allegedly, he had an abusive father, and his entire family was plagued by alcoholism. At some point, he drops out of high school in the 11th grade after he and his father supposedly got in a pretty violent altercation. And from there, he would turn to alcohol and minor crimes by his early 20s. He faced some pretty stiff charges in Nebraska for drug possession, resisting arrest, making threats against law enforcement, and all of those are classified as terroristic threats. So a warrant gets put out for his arrest. And he hauls ass, and he meets up with the Smiths somehow. And I told you about him being with them in Tennessee at that trailer park. But he was just kind of a wannabe, as that landlord in Tennessee also said, and I quoted him as saying, he just appeared to be some sort of follower and wanted to be accepted into a group. And he was also the sick sumbitch that shot, if you'll remember, Deputy Nielsen point blank after he already laid on the ground dying as it was. That's how sick and twisted this guy is. And in the end, he gets exactly what he deserved. He gets the death penalty inside of bloody Angola. But it took a while. He wasn't convicted until February of 2020, and he was formally sentenced to death just a couple of years ago in 2023, some 11 years after this incident. I would imagine because he was convicted in 2020, what happened right after he was convicted? He was convicted in February of 2020, of course, late March, COVID, and it put things off. And he wasn't actually formally sentenced to death until 2023, 11 years after the incident. He's on death row as of today. And in that case, get this, and this is a little bit rare. It's not very common that you would deliberate for just 22 minutes to convict someone in a death penalty case, but that's what happened here. That's how clear the evidence was. So we covered the actual shooters and what happened to them, and let's get into some of the, I guess you would call it, co-conspirators. And the first person we're going to talk about is the wife of Terry Smith, the leader of this group, and her name was Chanel Scaines. And Chanel was 37 years old when this originally went down. She was born in 1975, so she would be 50 years old approximately today as I record this. And she was the second wife of Terry Smith. Now, she was originally arrested for accessory after the fact. Now, at some point, her charges do get upgraded to being a principal to first-degree murder. However, because she testified against Joekel, eventually she gets sentenced to 5 years in prison. She serves that time with good credits, and she ends up getting released sometime around 2017, and not much else is known about her. And I'm sure her role in the shooting as far as trying to comfort the deputies, shielding them at one point from her husband, I'm sure that played a role. And the fact that she testified against some of these individuals, I'm sure that played a role in her sentence. And it was interesting that she cooperated pretty quickly considering the charges she was facing. Probably a smart thing. As a matter of fact, in November of 2012, she took that plea deal. So just a few months after all of this occurred. Now, someone that I haven't told you a whole lot about is Derek Smith. Derek Smith was the younger son of Terry Smith and Brian Smith, and he was also arrested in connection with this incident. Now, he was not directly involved in the shooting that took place at that trailer park. However, when they investigated him, he does get charged with 2 counts of accessory after the fact and a felon in possession of a firearm. And he gets some time for that because he was already a felon. You get found with a firearm. He actually picked up 12 years at hard labor for that, plus 5 years at hard labor for the accessory after the fact charge. He ends up serving it in a detention center, and he gets released on good time. And this is in April 1st of 2017 after serving about 4.5 years of his sentence. And he was placed under supervised probation in the custody of his grandmother at that point. And maybe he learned his lesson, right? Nope. His freedom is very short-lived. As a matter of fact, on August 12th of 2017, just 5 months after he was released, he gets rearrested for illegal weapon possession, which violated his parole. It leads to his return to custody, and he goes back to prison. Now, I don't have any information on if he has been released again or not, so I'm not going to speculate on that. But he did get out and 5 months later end up back in jail in 2017. Unbelievable. So I'm going to reference another article now. This article also from the Times-Picayune, and it talks a little bit about Chanel Scaines and her testifying at a preliminary hearing, and I found it very interesting. It again helps to paint the picture here, and it reads, Chanel Scaines knelt on the gravel of a LaPlace trailer park where she lived with her husband, daughter, and stepsons, clutching the hand of a St. John Parish deputy who had been struck in a hail of gunfire just seconds before, stroking his hair and forehead. Quote, "Are they talking to you?" she asked the deputy in a panic, referring to the voices she heard broadcasting over a sheriff's office issued radio that lay on the ground next to him. The deputy mumbled, "Yes, they're coming." Scaines reassured him between bouts of sobbing and frantic pleas for help. So frantic, in fact, that she hadn't noticed her own gunshot wound in her arm. "They're coming," she told him. "I promise you they're coming." But help would arrive too late. Moments later, the deputy died, one of the 2 casualties of a horrific ambush on August 16th, 2012. That ambush claimed the lives of deputies Jeremy Triche and Brandon Nielsen and left deputies Michael Scott Boynton and Jason Triche with injuries so severe that Boynton required 6 or 7 surgeries, and Triche had to have his spleen, gallbladder, and one of his kidneys removed. 4 suspects will stand trial for those crimes, including Skane's husband, Terry Smith, stepsons Derek and Brian Smith, as well as Kyle Joekel. Terry and Derek Smith are charged with being a principal to attempted first-degree murder. Brian Smith and Joekel are each charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder in the deaths of Jeremy, Triche, and Nielsen. If convicted, they face possible death sentences. Skanes and Brittany Keith, Brian Smith's girlfriend, had pleaded guilty to accessory charges. The charges against Tanisha Bright, who told authorities she simply had hitched a ride home with the Smiths that August day and was initially booked with being a principal to attempted first-degree murder, were refused in October of last year. On Friday morning, in a tearful 2-hour testimony during the preliminary examination, Skanes recalled the fear, the panic, and violence that unspooled across the scenic Riverview mobile home that August morning. Shortly after 4 a.m. on August 16th, Skanes says she received a puzzling phone call from her stepson, Derek. Skanes had just gotten out of bed in the mobile home she shared with her husband, Terry Smith, and had gone to the kitchen to make coffee. She knew Terry and his sons would be arriving home from the Valero Refinery in LaPlace, where they worked late shifts. And then her phone rang. Quote, "The cops are chasing us," Derek Smith told her, then abruptly hung up. Quote, "I thought he was playing a joke because he liked to do practical things like that," she testified. But because Skanes knew that her husband, who drove a Chevy truck, did not have a driver's license, she began to worry that perhaps the group had run into trouble. She walked out of the trailer just as they pulled up. Terry, Derek, and Brian Smith, as well as Kyle Joekel and Bright, a neighbor and fellow employee who Terry Smith often shuttled to and from work, poured out of that truck. Quote, "I asked Terry what was going on. He told me that Brian had shot a guard." Terry Smith was referring to Deputy Michael Scott Boynton, who Brian Smith allegedly shot with an assault rifle outside the Valero parking lot after Boynton tried to pull them over. The Smiths then sped down Bayou Steel Road back to the trailer. Terry Smith told Skanes to go back inside the trailer. She obliged. Meanwhile, he returned to his truck. The others, including Skanes, convened inside the trailer. Keith was also present at the trailer. According to Skanes, Derek Smith left the trailer shortly thereafter. Quote, "Then Brian said, 'Dad's turning on me,'" Skanes testified. "He was pacing, talking, saying we had to leave, we got to go, we can't stay here." Skanes said in her testimony that Brian Smith often exhibited paranoid behavior, peering out of windows as if he were being followed, distrusting his loyal family and friends. Quote, "I said, no, it's okay," Skanes said. Terry Smith returned from his car with a rifle slung over his shoulder. As Terry Smith went to lay the rifle on the bed, Skanes picked up the firearm and tucked it under a pile of clothes in the closet, along with her purse, which held a handgun. Terry Smith left the trailer, and moments later, Skanes heard voices outside. Quote, "I assumed it was the police because I could hear the radios." Then there was a knock on a door. I opened the door and there was a policeman standing there. He said, "Hi, how are you doing? I'd like to talk to you for a second." I had my dog in my hand and said, "Let me come outside." I put the dog on a leash and stepped outside. When I did, Terry was sitting at the picnic table handcuffed. Skanes testified she noticed 2 other deputies staring near the corner of her trailer, and the deputy who had knocked on the door told her to go back in the trailer. He followed her inside. Brian Smith, his girlfriend Brittany Keith, and Bright had disappeared into the bathroom. Joekel was lying in Skanes' bed, hiding under the covers. The officer quickly noticed Joekel and asked him to step outside. Skanes, Joekel, and the officer then left the trailer. Skanes sat down at the picnic table. The next thing Skanes knew, the deputies were wrestling Joekel to the ground. Skanes' 13-year-old daughter, who also testified on Friday, had been in Derek Smith's trailer for the entire episode, but she said she distinctly heard Joekel scream, "They're going to kill us all." Skanes said she saw one of the officers kick Joekel. She said another officer drew a gun and threatened to shoot Terry Smith as well as Skanes' dog, who had been barking since the deputies showed up. They put the gun in Terry's face, saying he should just shoot them, Skanes said. He said, "I'll just shoot the dog." "No, you can't shoot the dog," he said. "I'll shoot both of you." I'm trying to hush the dog, Skanes continued, and the door of the trailer swings open. Skanes said she then saw Brian in her peripheral vision. In the doorway of the trailer, she heard gunshots, grabbed her dog, and rolled under the picnic table. She said, I heard a bunch of shooting, then everything went quiet, and I was screaming, stop, stop. Then I heard Brian say, I've been shot. Skanes said she began crawling toward the camper from under the picnic table where she had been hiding, and when she turned her head, she noticed Joekel walking along the side of the trailer. She said Joekel knelt down and picked up a rifle. Moments later, gunfire resumed, and Skanes once again buried her head in her arms. Quote, I guess Brian had just threw the gun out the door, she said. Joekel picked it up, started screaming he was going to kill them, and he started firing down at the police officer. Although Skanes later said she did not actually see Joekel shoot a deputy, she confirmed that she did see him point the barrel of the gun downward toward the ground. Only later would she notice the deputy lying nearby. Deputy David Anthony Bullock, who was also present during the ambush, testified in September that he had seen a pair of legs fire shots into the body of Deputy Brandon Nielsen. And I quoted you that. Then it went quiet, Skanes said. She said she grabbed the dog and ran across the street to Derek Smith's trailer, where he and his 13-year-old daughter had been during the shooting. Skanes left the dog there and ran back toward her trailer, where she noticed a deputy, presumably Jeremy Triche, bleeding on the ground. She knelt beside him. Quote, he was laying there. I asked if he was okay. She held his hand, smoothed his hair, and told him help was on the way. Skanes said that she then spotted Terry Smith. Skanes told the deputy that she'd be right back, and she and Smith returned to the trailer, where Brian Smith was on the floor bleeding from a gunshot wound. She looked at him and told him, quote, you're crazy. As Skanes began walking back to the fallen deputy, she noticed Derek Smith and her daughter coming toward her. She said she pleaded for them to stay away. Skanes grabbed her daughter's hand and took the child to her aunt's trailer. Skanes then ran back to the deputy. As the deputy radio continued to cackle beside them, Skanes screamed, hurry, I'm losing him. I don't have any weapons. Please hurry. Then Skanes testified between fits of tears he stopped breathing. Only then, Skanes said, did she realize she had been shot, presumably by a bullet from Brian Smith's gun. Quote, they grabbed me, Skanes said, and got the ambulance, and I went to the hospital because I had been shot. Skanes was one of 9 witnesses in court, etc., etc. And I wanted to read you that because I just talked about Derek Smith, and there's just not a whole lot regarding him. And there are a few more players in all of this. Let's get into Brittany Keith. She was the girlfriend of Brian Smith. And I mean, you reckon something's wrong with these girls' pickers? I mean, find a classy guy, ladies. She was 23 years old when all this went down. She was also charged with accessory after the fact. And she was also in that trailer when this incident went down, as I told you. She also shared in that same ideology as a sovereign citizen group member. And during the gun battle, she was inside the trailer when the ambush occurred. Now, she was charged with principal to first-degree murder, and she was not as cooperative as Skanes in all this. She didn't testify against any other individuals, and thus her sentence was a lot harder than Skanes. And again, it took what seemed like forever to get her sentenced. As a matter of fact, it was February 14th of 2022 before she is sentenced to 2 concurrent 5-year terms and 3 years of probation. But she had been in jail for quite a while on all of this, so it was time served for her. And from what I understand, she's not in jail anymore. That's just from what I understand. Take that with a grain of salt. Now, remember Tanisha Bright, who was 21 at the time that all this went down. I've already referenced this, but of course, they discovered she was just wrong place, wrong time, wrong fucking people. And sure, her charges were dropped, and rightfully so. So to quickly go over everything you just heard, Terry Smith, the one that was driving the car when Deputy Boynton was shot in the initial shooting, he was never convicted in this case. However, he was convicted for those disgusting rapes and incest charges. He ends up with 2 life sentences plus 95 years, and he was the leader of this group. Brian Smith, his son, 24, he was deemed mentally incompetent to stand trial, but he is in a forensic mental hospital for likely the rest of his life. Kyle Joekel, who was 28, he was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder. He received the death penalty inside bloody Angola. Derek Smith, 22 at the time, the son of the leader of this group, he pleaded guilty to possession of a firearm and accessory after the fact. He was released in 2017. However, he was rearrested in 2017 for weapons violations. I don't know where he's at as of this point. Chanel Scaines, Terry's wife, pleaded guilty, was the first person to take a plea in this case. Of course, she testified in trial, and she received 5 years probation primarily for her help with the prosecution. Now, a couple of things that are worth mentioning that occurred during all of this, and it came out during the testimony of Deputy Michael Boynton that he was having some very serious issues with his police radio system that day. So again, I'm going to directly reference an article by the Times-Picayune. This was May 24th of 2013, where Boynton testified on just that subject. It says Deputy Michael Boynton lay flat in his patrol car, dazed and bleeding from the 4 bullets that had torn into his body just seconds before. He had seen the muzzle flash from the truck window and felt the searing pain that followed. Now, ahead of him, the truck's brake lights were fiery red. Were they coming back for him to finish him off? Boynton's hand was on his radio, moving the dial, hoping to hear the familiar chirping sound of a connection. Nothing. For the 3rd time that morning, Deputy Boynton's police radio had failed him. As the legal proceedings continue for the group accused of shooting Boynton and 3 other St. John the Baptist Parish Sheriff's deputies last August, killing 2, testimony in a preliminary hearing has spotlighted something deputies in the parish have known for a long time. Throughout St. John, there are areas where emergency radios cannot snag a signal. Boynton was the first to come into contact with the alleged attackers on August 16th about 4 a.m. in the LaPlace parking lot. But when Boynton tried to call for backup, before the deadly bout of violence began to unfurl, nothing happened. His radio couldn't find a signal. During testimony in a preliminary hearing last month, Boynton said he tried unsuccessfully to use his radio at least twice before he was shot, and at least once after. By the time he was able to reach headquarters, the truck and his passengers were well on their way to a LaPlace trailer park where they would attack and kill more deputies. So I just wanted to reference that, and I'm not going to read the rest of the article, but pretty crazy that these radios, these deputies were having so many problems with these radios, and man, that is serious. And I thought it was important to mention that and reference just a piece of that article. And another thing worth mentioning, while awaiting some sort of trial, it also came out that Terry Smith was planning an escape from jail, and that was reported by the Times-Picayune on February 27th of 2015. And here's what was reported about that incident. It said Terry Smith, one of the 3 men indicted in connection with the shooting death of 2 St. John the Baptist Parish Sheriff's deputies and the wounding of 2 others, jailbreak plans were foiled before he could make his attempt, a Baton Rouge television station reports. Another inmate at the Hunt Correctional Center, located in St. Gabriel, told guards about Smith's plans, and that was reported by WBRZ television. According to the news report, it appeared Smith was planning a Shawshank Redemption type escape attempt, having dug a hole in the cinder block wall, and it made gloves from boots and a vest from a sack and some legal papers. The TV station also reported Smith had survival guide tips. And so that's how that read. Thank God that guy did not get away. Now, I'm going to reference one more article today because it gives you an idea of the mindset of these individuals. And it's really an article on the families of the fallen, asking why, which, if you ever have a tragic situation happen in your family, that's a question, right? That's a human side of a tragedy. You want to know why. So I'm going to reference this article from the Times-Picayune from June 9th of 2014. And it reads, Eddie Triche leapt up from her seat in the back row of the courtroom and ran outside. She looked up toward the sky and she screamed. For hours, for days on end, listening to dozens of witnesses recount how her son, St. John the Baptist Parish Sheriff's Deputy Jeremy Triche, was shot dead at a LaPlace trailer park last summer. But in that one moment, as she heard how he tried to run from an assault rifle fire, Eddie Triche was broken by grief. Her whole world changed that day, August 16th of 2012, a date that will forever be seared into the parish collective memory. It wasn't yet dawn, and two deputies, Brandon Nielsen and Jeremy Triche, both fathers and husbands, lay dead in the gravel of a scenic Riverview mobile home park in LaPlace. Two other deputies were grievously injured. In the years since the shooting, the wounded deputies have returned home from the hospital, but with permanent disabilities and constant reminders of the horrors they faced that morning. The widows of the two dead, strangers before, have become best friends. They call each other nearly every day to cry or shout or laminate all the things that their husbands have missed. Birthdays, first fishing trips, dance recitals, and skinned knees. Quote, "You wouldn't think it would take an entire year to realize he's never coming home," said Nielsen's wife, Danielle. "It's unbelievable that it has been a year. Sometimes it feels like I saw him last week. Sometimes it feels like forever." The community continues to mourn with them. A ceremony marking the anniversary is scheduled for Friday. The details of the shootings have been pieced together through a half dozen hearings and testimony from other officers, the killer's accomplices, and innocents who witnessed some of the events. But the family still struggle to comprehend what might have provoked a group of strangers to gun down four good men. There's just one word all can come up with: evil. And I couldn't agree more with that. As they sat in jail cells for a year, the family accused of the killings have written various manifestos maintaining their allegiance as sovereign citizens. A loose but volatile group of anti-government extremists. They are described by the FBI as domestic terrorists, and their encounters with authority, particularly police, routinely turn violent. Quote, "They proclaim me anti-government. Bitch, I am a sovereign citizen," one of the accused wrote in a rap found scribbled on the back of a police report in his jail cell. Quote, "You approach me, you better be ready to get in. To wear a badge is a sin. You will be put to death. My bullets will be cutting through your vest." 7 people were originally charged in the massacre. Avowed sovereign citizen Terry Smith has announced his deep distrust in the government with his 2 sons, Brian and Derek. The Smith family, originally from North Louisiana, has stuck together, moving from state to state, trailer to trailer, picking up jobs as welders and day laborers at construction sites. Terry Smith's wife, Chanel Skanes, and Brian Smith's girlfriend, Brittany Keith, traveled with them. In Tennessee, months before the shootings in LaPlace, they met like-minded Nebraska outlaw Kyle Joekel, who fled his home state in a high-speed chase after threatening to kill any cop who tried to control him. Joekel and the Smith family had a few things in common. Both were on the run from the law, and both shared a profound hatred for law enforcement. Brian Smith and Joekel would months later become the accused gunmen in the LaPlace killings. But prosecutors suggested in court filings had planned to slaughter officers long before they moved into the back of the LaPlace trailer park. Derek Smith, during one of his many prior incarcerations, wrote his brother a letter from jail. Quote, "Dad said he wanted to go to war with the police. Well, I'm going to see if he bout that," he scribbled. "I ain't got nothing to live for anymore, so I'm going to take everyone to hell with me. I found out where my old PO," and he means probation officer, "lives. I'm going to get his wife and kids and let him live in pain." That letter, found in one of the son's trailers after the LaPlace massacre, has become evidence in this case against them. Prosecutors point to it as proof that the father not only knew of his son's murderous intentions, but encouraged them. Of the 7 charged, only 3 still await trial. One, 22-year-old Tanisha Bright, was released after authorities decided she was telling the truth. And of course, we went through all that, so I won't go through it again. It does pick up at the end of the article, and it says, Eddie Triche still catches herself waiting for her 27-year-old son to walk through the door. He stopped by often just to say hello, drink a Coke, snack on a Hershey bar. It took months before she stopped buying his favorite treats. He was married to Misty Triche, and they had a toddler together named Cade, who had just turned 3. Jeremy has missed all of the everyday things, she said, tucking him into bed, teaching him how to fish. Cade doesn't have that anymore. When he comes here, we talk about his father. We go through pictures. He will remember his dad. Dozens of fellow officers and family pack the back rows of the courtroom whenever Smiths and Joekel are set to appear. But Danielle Nielsen tries to avoid the hearings. She likes to remember the things she loved about her husband, how he changed the words to songs to make her laugh while they drove in the car, how he made funny faces when his picture was taken, how much he loved his 2 daughters and 3 stepsons. Quote, we were a team, she said. He was my best friend. The only part of him she wants to forget is how he died. She doesn't go to every hearing, so she can manage to get up in the morning and be strong for her youngest daughter, now getting ready to start the 3rd grade. Quote, I'm all she's got now. I've got to be strong. I've got to take care of us, give her the sense of security we had when he was here. That's all on me now, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody else. She has woken up 359 mornings without him, but all the first have passed for now for her. The first Christmas, first birthdays, first day of school, graduations, first Thanksgiving alone, and she hopes that now, without the constant tide of milestones, she might finally get some peace. And, you know, people don't sometimes think about how tough when these things happen is how tough it is on the families. My heart just breaks for all of these families, and people often forget that they're victims too. So I've told you all that, but I hadn't told you a whole lot about the 2 fallen officers, and I want to honor them and just tell you a little more about them. And we'll start with Brandon Joseph Nielsen. And according to what I've read about him, he was born in 1977. He dedicated his life to law enforcement, which culminated in a 1-year term as a deputy sheriff with St. John the Baptist Sheriff's Office, where he served as a motorcycle officer. He was 34 years old at the time of his death, and he was known by his colleagues for his dedication and positive spirit. He was survived by his wife and 5 children, and his parents and his sister. And of course, annual memorials continue at the sheriff's office with remembrances on social media, etc., honoring Nielsen as exactly what he was, a hero who was shot and killed while serving his community. Also killed Jeremy Michael Triche. He was born in 1984, from what I understand, just 27 years old at the time of his death. He was a dedicated family man, survived by his wife and son, and he was known as having a kind of a passion for fishing, a hobby that later community fundraisers would be held in his memory, like fishing tournaments and things of that nature. And he embodied a strong commitment to helping others, which was a trait that extended from his personal life into his professional life, obviously, as a law enforcement officer. He served with the St. John Parish Sheriff's Office for approximately 4 years until he was gunned down, and he was specifically assigned as a canine handler, and he had a reputation for selflessness and dedication to protecting and serving, and the Sheriff's Office, of course, honor him. He has a memorial page as well on their website. Now, I also want to mention Jason Triche, who was also shot. He underwent a kidney transplant in 2017. And from what I understand, he's returned to the sheriff's office in an IT role despite having some pretty tough mobility challenges now. And as far as Michael Boynton, he was discharged from the hospital within 3 months of the shooting, despite being shot with an assault rifle. A pretty strong guy right there, if that doesn't speak to just his sheer strength. And y'all, I know that was a hard one for you to hear, but think about it next time you come across someone in law enforcement. Maybe shake their hand, thank them for their service, because this type of shit can happen anytime, on any day, in any given place. And I'm sure that I did not cover every detail in this case as much as I would have loved to. I just don't have access to everything in this case. I wasn't there. I don't have direct knowledge. I would, however, extend an invitation to anyone from the families of the slain officers to those still in law enforcement in St. John Parish. I would love to know more about who these deputies were, and just an open invite to any of you that would like to come on Bloody Angola and shine a light on who these guys were outside of what I was just able to find by reading about them. Open invite. Come on the show. Let's talk about it. I just can't speak to what occurred on the inside of that because I don't have any direct knowledge of that. And look, anytime we cover these cases, as I said from the beginning, no matter how good our intentions are, information sometimes can get slightly twisted. I'm all about correcting the record. Let me know if something is grossly misstated somewhere in this podcast. I'll be happy to correct it and correct that record. I'm certainly not perfect, but I'm only as good as the information that is out there available to the public. So if it's something you would like me to bring up, I can certainly bring it up on a subsequent episode of Bloody Angola. Again, my sincere thoughts and prayers to everyone who knew and loved not only those heroes that lost their life in this event, but those that were injured, and everyone with the St. John the Baptist Parish Sheriff's Office. Thank you all so much for listening. And until next time, for Bloody Angola, a podcast 142 years in the making, the complete story of America's bloodiest prison. Peace.
I walk a straight line, shackled and chained. Oh, gruesome Gertie is calling my name. There is no mercy in this penitentiary. Just ask the Hill String Gang, or